is beyond compliance, climate risk, impacts, and strategy for the U.S. jewelry industry. And let's face it, the U.S. is in a tough spot right now. Even if they don't say it, I will say it. We have a lot of stuff to fix. And yes, we are part of the world, but at the same time, we also have kind of a present that is laden with greater problems than we had, say, prior to the most recent presidential election. So we're delighted to welcome Peter Boyd, who is a resident fellow at the Yale Center for Business and the Environment, and founder and CEO of Time for Good. That, by the way, is an abbreviated bio, as all bios are, but in every packet, there is a bio document. It's organized alphabetically. Yes, it was a point in time, so there are a couple that need to be perhaps added, but that is in there for your reference. Yes, they too are abbreviated, but less so. Everything in life is kind of an edit. I want to say hello virtually to Mark Hanna, who was to be with us today and cannot. He is ever an inspiration. And I want to welcome Lisa Sachs, who is with us virtually. She is the director of the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, Columbia Climate School, and associate professor of professional practice, Faculty of Climate, Columbia University. And then John Mulligan, who is head of sustainable strategy at the World Gold Council and president of Sustainable Development Commission at CIBJO, and one of my real guiding lights. So I turn this over to them, and this is going to be wonderful. Thank you, everybody. Woo! Shit. Excuse me. That was graceful.
So good morning, everybody, and good morning to you online. And I'd also like to say hello to Mark Hanna. Sorry you can't be here, Mark. I mentioned that because Mark, I think, was instrumental in bringing me to the first of these events. And I think I've done 5 or 6 now, is that right, Lisa? And it's interesting, because the world is very much a different place from when I first attended and first presented with Mark. So, hello, Mark. First of all, I'd also like to say thank you, of course, to Lisa. I think many of you know how much hard work, Lisa, both Lisas, thank you, how much hard work goes into curating and convening this event, and I'm always amazed at the diligence and hard work that Lisa Koenigsberg puts in, so thank you again, Lisa. Lisa promised you an ecstatic ride. I want to set expectations. I'm not quite sure how much ecstatic content, but nonetheless we hope to at least engage and offer some insights. I'm overjoyed to be joined by Peter and Lisa. Lisa, we can see you on screen. I hope you can see us. So thank you again. Lisa's in Southeast Asia, so we very much appreciate her taking the time. It's not, I presume, that early in the morning there, so thank you again. The subject matter, Beyond Compliance is the title, and I think it's worth, I mentioned the world has changed, and several of you would have probably heard me speak about various aspects of climate before. And I think we tried in some of those earlier discussions to lay out the kind of discussion around decarbonization, what a pathway might look like, what the gold industry and gold mining in particular has done already. But as I say, we need to address the changes that have happened in the world since, and we need to discuss what practical action might look like. We can also discuss what practical leadership looks like, and Peter often advises executive teams in climate and sustainability strategy. And so I advise you, if you want a little free advice and guidance, please just raise your hand, ask questions. This is a fairly small, intimate space, so I'm going to encourage a degree of informality, if you wish. If we don't make any sense, if I don't make any sense, please feel free to challenge me, because I think we're here to talk about practicalities. So this issue of moving beyond disclosure and compliance, well, first of all, we need to basically set the framework, set an understanding of what the world currently looks like. And I think the challenge really is for us to talk about climate in a way that is meaningful to business, meaningful to corporates, to sectors. And that's what I'm going to be asking my contributors to look to. But first of all, I'd like to restate something. And I always start these conversations by saying, I'm not going to talk about the terrible science and the terrible facts. And then I always do. And I'm going to do so again, because I think frequently when we talk about net zero and climate, it can seem quite abstract. And Lisa said we're moving beyond abstraction. And often people seem to describe something like net zero as if it's a policy decision, a response, an optional policy decision. The science tells us that there is no option, there is no choice. And just to take a stock take of where we are, well, the last decade, 2015 to 2025, is undoubtedly the hottest decade on record. And that's not a temporary fluctuation, it's not an oscillation, it is absolutely an enduring trend. We now have undoubtedly an energy imbalance, and that basically means that excess heat accumulating in the Earth has more than doubled since 1995. We can experience it, and certainly Europe now is starting to feel excess heat as a reality, and I think, presumably New York too. Marine heat. Marine heat has more than tripled since 1990. Hugely important. Glacier loss, rising sea levels, they continue unabated. Wildlife populations. So we're going to talk about climate and nature because they're absolutely intertwined. Populations have diminished 73% since 1970. There was a lot less biodiversity in the world now than there was, certainly when I was born and after. 7 out of 9 planetary boundaries have been breached. Now, for those of you who aren't aware of the concept of planetary boundaries, this is a bunch of scientists who got together to say, what are the safe conditions for human social and economic development? What do we need to basically grow as humans? We have broken 7 out of 9. So this is now an existential crisis. It isn't a policy issue, although policy issues obviously count. And yesterday I was very mindful of the discussion around pearls and the fact that pearls are an indication, if you like, of the health of oceans. Ocean acidity has increased 30 to 40% since the industrialized period. So we now have far more acidic oceans than we did. A lot of bad news. What, however, we have discovered is that within the climate and the nature discussions, facts and alarm don't necessarily provoke the response we're after. We need somehow to make this state of affairs more meaningful and human. And Peter always, or has frequently told a story I'm going to ask him to repeat, a metaphor, if you will, about how we can understand those challenges in a kind of human way. Peter, do you mind me giving the
story again? Yeah, well, good. And hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay? It's working well. And we've got our virtual chair for our Asian correspondent here. Well, yeah, so I sort of travel around. I'm not an expert of just about any industry, but I travel around different industries and try and help those that care about sustainability and resilience communicate outside this room. So when you go back to your teams, it's just like, how can you tell the story in a way that then potentially resonates and gets people on board. And what I like about an outsider coming into this industry is that potentially there's some long-standing brands, there's some long-standing industries, long-standing companies within. So the analogy that I use often on this is sort of 4.6 billion years is roughly, the age of the planet, more or less geologically. So let's make that real as a sort of company age of, say, like, take the company, the world as a going concern is 46 years old. So you've got a 46-year-old going concern company called The World. And then 4 hours ago, we took on a new employee called The Human. So we were going fine as a going concern, and then we took on The Human 4 hours ago. And in the last minute, this new employee called The Human decided to destroy 50% of the world's trees. And then in the last 20 seconds, that same new employee you took on 4 hours ago destroyed 68% of the world's other living beings, the biodiversity. So the answer for the question for anyone else in the room is like, what would you do with this new employee called The Human that you'd just taken on? Probably what would you do? Certainly wouldn't promote them. But it just sort of gives you the sort of idea of like there's an urgency here and an action on a sort of this is just a sustainability piece on the planet. The other one, I loved this piece was the theme of like resilience is beyond compliance to beyond abstraction. And this idea of this air heat, sort of what John talked about, the science of sort of the blanket that is sort of basically heating us up through greenhouse gases. People tend to think it's like you pollute and it goes into space. It's like, 10-minute drive from here. Here you might only get a few blocks, but like 10-minute drive from here, you can think about how far out of the city you might get. It's only a 10-minute drive up if you just turned your car upwards and drove up. And so it's this blanket that is heating us. It's not this abstract concept of a sky that sort of gets our pollution and just puts it somewhere. We are heating this very thin blanket. And there's a wonderful photo from NASA around the 1970s, sort of where you see the world from the side, not just the blue marble. And it's just it's the width of a lacquer of the globe in somebody's library. So I tend to think of these two stories as a way to kind of just take this abstraction of sustainability out and say, like, what are we protecting? And you really are agents of this. We're fellow agents of trying to make sure that this is sustainable.
Thanks. And I always think it's, making it real, making it human is one of our tasks that we have to do if you want to incentivize change and climate action. I mentioned at the start this issue of compliance and disclosure, and it's fair to say that we have a fairly complex landscape now of reporting and disclosure, and how the world tries to evidence change or demonstrate change. First of all, I'm going to address something which I think Lisa mentioned, and I'm going to ask for both of your opinions. We're in New York, we're in the US, and I spend a lot of time elsewhere, like yourself, a traveler. And frequently when we're talking about climate policy, climate action, we've started to almost talk about the US as an outlier, as a kind of exception. It certainly is, we always say something like, accept the US headwinds, or accept the US context. As both of you are very, very involved with a global perspective, but obviously based in the US, I'm going to start with you, Lisa, if you don't mind. How do you respond to, adapt, contextualize the US response, or US current status, if you like, in terms of what drives climate reporting, climate action? What is the state of play from your perspective?
Thank you so much, and I'm sorry not to be there with you in person. I'm actually in Hong Kong right now, on my way to Southeast Asia, also spending some time in Asia, because I actually think we have a lot to learn from some of the approaches here. So it's actually why I'm here, helping to advance an integrated decarbonized energy system in Southeast Asia, but also learning from a lot of what's happening in China and in Hong Kong. First of all, it's been such a pleasure to exchange with John on these topics that, as John knows, I have a lot to say about. I should mention, for those who don't know me, that I am probably more existentially concerned about climate change and the impacts that are here already now, and more broadly, not just climate change, but living in a sustainable, peaceful world. That means more broadly staying within ecological limits, which we are pushing our limits of all the time, not just in a climate sense, but also having access to basic goods and services around the world, including access to energy and food security, which we haven't achieved. So that has been my motivating, that has been my motivation for my entire career. I say that because I am a deep critic of our current approach to understanding these challenges and thinking about how we solve them. I think fundamentally, maybe as a basic point, I think we've conflated risk management and understanding risk, which is critically important to do because we face a lot of risks, and from a business perspective or a public perspective, we should understand them and how we manage them and communicate that to our stakeholders. But that is a completely different challenge from actually mitigating the underlying risks by changing the systems to systems that are sustainable systems, affordable, resilient, decarbonized, accessible, and affordable systems. That we don't build those systems through risk management. That's at least one core conflation. And a second that is related to the first, but is a bit different, is that the disclosure regime suggests that the challenge is overwhelmingly one of information and the lack of information. And I don't think that that's the case either for risk management or for building new systems. And what I fear, as John knows, is that we've spent a lot of time developing and refining disclosure regimes and other mechanisms for financial regulation or entity-level reporting and target setting that are largely disconnected from both the imperative of prudent risk management and from the imperative of building sustainable societies. And there are a lot of consequences of that. And this answers your question, John, because one consequence is that building the sustainable systems of the future are eminently feasible if we were oriented toward what that looks like, which we're not. So it's been a major distraction. There are some trade-offs and tensions that come from thinking that risk management will lead to improved outcomes. Sometimes it can have the opposite effect, but more profoundly, it has led to the politicization of things that I actually don't think would otherwise have been political. Prudent risk management shouldn't be politically contentious. I think it became contentious largely when we suggested that managing or identifying, disclosing, and managing risk had anything to do with sustainability or climate policy, which it didn't. And it made what was otherwise prudent risk management a political issue, which it shouldn't have been. And likewise, thinking actually thoughtfully about how do we build what are eminently compelling systems, lots of investment opportunities, lots of financing opportunities in fast-growing markets, that also shouldn't have been so contentious. And it was. It's not to say that there was no political component of this, but I think that the confusion about what we're trying to achieve and what the right, how we solve those problems, including the respective roles of different stakeholders, the difference in risk management, and actually building those systems, and then what instruments and tools we use to achieve those outcomes, that confusion has cost us a lot. And I think that where I see us in the US is painful for a lot of reasons, and it's not only attributable to this confusion, but I don't think the confusion helps, which is why I've been striving for more clarity so that we can both achieve better outcomes and also diffuse the political narratives. So maybe I'll pause there, although I'm sure there's much more to discuss.
Thank you. I'm going to come back and ask you for what that clarity might look like. But I'm first of all going to turn to Peter and say, from your perspective, Peter, the US context, the headwinds, as I called them, how do you see it?
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm actually doing a late career master's over in Cambridge, UK. So just coming back from 70 people from around the world, sort of studying this and researching it, and And it's an interesting one. There's a phrase in the Bali Climate Conference from Papua New Guinea. They stood up in the open floor of the climate talks and said, we have a saying in our country, like, lead or get out the way. So the US, please lead or get out the way. And the US did a 180 within the climate talks in Bali on that one. And I just felt, being in Europe coming back, just there was a sense of like, get out of the way. But having said that, what I see in the US picture of the clients that I see and the students that I see coming through is actually something a little bit different and a bit more nuanced. I think, so 22,000 companies disclosed to CDP in 2025, the most ever, and I think a big chunk of them coming from the US. 640 investors, over 100 trillion in assets under management, calling for that disclosure, which is an interesting one, sort of, as you say, we might pick up with Lisa later on, sort of where does the information regime fit. But I feel like there's a lot of action underneath the headwinds. There's people that are making good business decisions in sustainability that I see and pushing forwards sort of despite the rhetoric. May this year was the first time that solar took over from coal in the energy mix in the US, 22.8%, 22.2%. And that's, if you think about the rhetoric and you think about the drill baby drill and all the other very silly things that come out of a federal mouth on this stuff, like solar just making intuitive sense at a business level and at a grid stability level and all those pieces. So that's happening in the US right now. So I just see that there's the words that you might have heard, the sort of from greenwashing to green hushing, just sort of that this idea of open disclosure, open reporting has been replaced, but not by nothing, by a quieter, more, I think, a sort of, potentially, to use the word resilient, a more resilient sort of C-suite that wants to get somewhere sustainable. And I think that's one of the things that we hopefully return to later in the discussion, this idea of like, where is sustainability in the company's overall purpose? Is it part of why you exist? Or is it this thing that's a report that has to be filed and sent off to, frankly, now a government that doesn't care? Like, well, that's never gonna advance sustainability. But building a system that you need forever, like that's where sustainability, sort of can be in the U.S. and everywhere else in the world. So I see that in the U.S. As sort of federal headwinds, but there's quite a lot of action under the surface. And then there's also companies that are tapped into, sort of the EU legislation and sort of global supply chains, global reporting pieces, such that that's not going to go away when, sort of the US sort of at a federal level decides something's not important anymore.
Thanks. There's a couple of things there that I wouldn't say they're fully aligned in terms of the two positions, but I want to explore them a little further. Because you mentioned CDP and you mentioned some of the disclosure frameworks and some of the global frameworks that have now gained broad acceptance, I think, certainly. But Lisa, I'm interested to go back to your comment, because you said, how do we arrive at clarity, I think was the phrase, that will inform, meaningful action and change. I think Peter's point is a fairly good one, that there's action, but it may not be reported or as visible in the US, at least, context. But I'm interested again because I think you're saying that the kind of weight and to some extent burden of sustainability reporting, climate disclosures, etc., has exacerbated, amplified the politicization, made frankly the agenda vulnerable to politicization. So how do you, if you like, depoliticize, and how do you also still maintain some degree of transparency? Because in the end, people want to see credible action. I'll talk about leadership in a second, but first of all, yeah, that clarity and depoliticization aspect. Any ideas?
Yes, lots of ideas, and I think actually the consequences of the excessive or complicated, excessive reporting landscape have not only been the politicization, but I think it's also fatigue and confusion within some corporate and financial environments as well, and a distraction from what could be actual thoughtful approaches of both achieving positive sustainability outcomes, but also prudent risk management. And I hear stories like this all the time. Maybe just to share one example, I was at a conference of sustainability professionals in private equity, and without actually recognizing some of the irony, they were on one hand talking about how they can't get their deal teams to see that there can be value created in some of what they were describing as sustainability practices. There could be value created, but then equally, really without even seeing the irony, they were talking about how hard it was or how frustrated their C-suite was that some of their investors were coming to them with box checking exercises, asking them to have a net zero commitment that didn't mean much, and the C-suite was finding that annoying. Well, I thought that showed the utter confusion, because it's both a box checking exercise, and that obscures and makes the conversation complicated about what is really good practice. Where can value be created, and where can we mitigate risk? I think with the massive disclosure frameworks, we being the field, have tried to achieve a lot of different objectives without clarity and jammed them into a reporting framework that is producing a lot of information that is not actually decision useful for a lot of people. And it means that it's produced in a way that is not seen as strategic by companies. I may be exaggerating, you can tell me if I'm exaggerating, but by and large, relative to the size of the disclosure regime, I think we are spending a lot of time measuring and disclosing and preparing reports that are not useful to either the management or to those who are reading the reports. When, if we could actually focus on what do we mean by resilience, by understanding risks and managing them accordingly, or by thinking about where value can be created through different practices that build trust, or that access new markets, or that think about other ways to have positive impacts. I don't think that comes from this disclosure regime. So I think, John, to answer your question about transparency, because I'm asked that a lot, or how do we measure, how do we compare, I am not so concerned about that for the moment, actually, because I'd rather start from thinking, actually, what does it look like to operate in this changing world? What does it mean to be aware of the evolving risks and to manage them? What does it look like to try to have a positive impact or contribute to systems change, which is a different strategy? And then we figure out how to communicate that and to whom, once we're thoughtful about what we're trying to achieve. And I'm not yet so concerned about measurement and comparability, because I think that we end up being driven by the metrics and reporting rather than the thoughtfulness of what we're trying to do. So that's at least the part to me of bringing the clarity on top of, I guess, what I'm also trying to do, which is to, if we can move aside these reporting and to actually think clearly about the distinction between risk management and about what actually what actually addresses the underlying risk and the different objectives that we have with respect to mitigating but also managing the impacts of climate change. And with a clearer mind, we can think about the actual responsibilities and opportunities for boards as one entity of a broader system that had other responsibilities with respect to mitigating climate change and managing their responses. So that's how I'm trying to bring some clarity to the benefit of corporate boards and their stakeholders and the world as I see it.
Okay, thanks. I have a theory that within what we might call the climate agenda, it was the large financial institutions to some extent that set the agenda. And so financial risk and the risk from kind of asset owners, asset managers became a key driving force. Maybe the negative consequence of that is we lost focus on what we might call operational risk at a business level. And I'm aware that a lot of people in the audience are from SMEs and from small entities, and this may seem fairly abstract. Peter, you mentioned some of the advice you give on more operationally focused impacts. Do you want to just explain a little more about what that kind of practical aspects might be, and with a mind, if it's possible, that what might be sort of relevant for a range of businesses, including SMEs.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I could take that in a couple of different parts, because it's really interesting on this idea of sort of two things: this sort of risk management system design, and then this idea of the disclosure and how useful it is. And I think it depends on who we're talking to and where you are on the curve. So I actually think that risk management, some of the risk management discussions and is forcing it into the mainstream of the adoption curve boardrooms sometimes for the first time. And if you need risk to get it into the C-suite and for the CFO to care, go all in. You're the mainstream part of the curve. But if you're at the sort of front end, then I think that's where I'm sort of all in with Lisa. Is like the front end of the curve should be thinking about system design and systems thinking. And I feel like there's a role for disclosure and a role for the risk rhetoric to get the mainstream across. I mean, I teach systems thinking to graduates and into C-suites all day, and I love the ones that want to change the system. But there's not very many of them. Mm-hmm. And actually, we don't need, Mary Margaret Mead quote, we don't need too many of them in order for the system to be changed. There's this thing called diffusion theory, like we need the 15% to care, and then culture starts to move. So I'm always concentrating on who are these people, and do they have the ability to change the system? Can you in the room say like, yes, my board and my CEO, we're on it? It's just like, well then let's take, almost like with Lisa, it's like, let's take on a systems thinking journey. But I think there's a real role for the back end of the curve on sort of reporting, risk, measure what you manage, and then to the point of what are we talking about that's real? And I love that sort of beyond abstraction nudge, not just beyond compliance. It's like I've got a client at the moment that's a live entertainment company, completely different to this industry, but wrestling with much of the same risks, like physical risks. Like if there's a extreme weather event, then the festival doesn't happen, the sponsorship doesn't happen. Supply chain risks of getting things there is critical. Electricity and reliable power getting to that venue, water usage and the stress on the community by moving into that community and potentially back out again if it's a festival. These things are sort of, it's as much a sort of, if it's just a reporting tick box exercise, then most companies have sort of missed the point. It's a social license to operate in the community that you're in.
Yeah, and that, I think from my perspective, that kind of social license to operate aspect of, I mentioned transparency, I think is important. I think there's a role for reporting if the reporting then can be seen to support consequent action. And an example of that, frankly, is when we had done a lot of work and research on climate and the transition pathways and the idea of what does it take to decarbonize, in this case, the gold mining industry. And then we'd eventually said, we think this is achievable. We think, you can start to implement real change, and we do cost-benefit analysis and all sorts of things. But then we said to our members, who represent a good chunk of corporate gold production, and we want you to disclose via TCFD. So TCFD, and some of them knew what TCFD was, some of them didn't. By making some of them obliged to report by TCFD, we did force them then to start to consider certain footprint analysis to then say, how do we reduce the footprint? And is it measure what you manage? So I do think there is frameworks that incentivize action, and that's valid. And I think there are points of reference, probably for most people in this room, that will be relevant in terms of reporting and disclosure. That said, I am also aware that to some extent, the reporting frameworks have almost produced a kind of paralysis, where having talked to sustainability teams within companies, they've said that's all we're doing now. All we're doing is reporting. We're not actually acting anymore on the things we were aiming to achieve. So I think there's a balance to be struck. Just to go back to that thing of operations, you mentioned the entertainment company. Is there anything any kind of learnings that you can think of that you say, well, you've already mentioned a few. The fact that you need to consider tipping points or implications from one thing to another within a business? Because there's always the hidden benefits as well as the hidden risks.
Yeah, I mean, well, let's see, gosh, too many ways to go with this question. One is the hidden benefits. Let's just take a completely non-jewelry example for a second on the music industry, where they're talking about getting the resilience benefit. There's a cost premium to getting solar and storage out to a remote location versus the normal truck in with a diesel genset. And there's, what's the cost, et cetera. And then the sound engineer gets hold of this new system because the sustainability team helped put it in place. And he goes, do you hear that? And somebody said, no. It's like exactly. That's the sound, that's no diesel backup for this amazing music festival to happen and that artist to be heard more clearly by the fans. And that was like a non-sustainability benefit that had pushed through into sort of real life core music festival. And so I think that's an interesting one for the sustainability teams in any industry, is to say like what is either the business benefit, the community benefit, the stakeholder benefit of this, and can you co-write the goal? What we're doing in that company at the moment is the sustainability team is doing almost like a draft of a sustainability, like your principles and the industry, a draft principles, and saying, but you tell us what your in the field what your goals are. It could be like artisanry preservation, which I saw in the program, and it's like, and then could we kind of co-create language where this new goal becomes important to both of us. The sustainability team to drive through to the sort of the goals that we've set out, maybe at the net zero level, and the business benefit or the artistic preservation benefit, and they come together. And when that language comes together, then I have a hope as a sort of outsider going, this might actually happen, because these two are both excited about it.
So I was going to. Lisa always likes to discuss language and its impacts. There's a tension here, I think, between the critique of the current environment. Is there, Lisa, for you then examples of, kind of good practice, both in terms of responses to what we might call the regulatory environment and clarity on action? Have you encountered, and I'm putting you on the spot here, but examples that give you.
I'm always happy to be.
Yeah, they give you a sense of, well, this is what I mean. This is what I'm trying to get at in terms of that real impact approach, rather than.
Yeah.
Please.
And maybe to start with a bit of a I want to say reality check, but I want to be a little bit nicer about that. But I've been working in the extractive sector for 20 years. I just wrote a post about this the other day because it's just about my 20th anniversary of working in the mining sector and thinking about how we can leverage natural resources for sustainable development, which of course is relevant for many in the room. And the reality is that 20 years on, we're facing many of the same challenges and asking many of the same questions that we were 20 years ago. And I think, and my diagnosis in that reflection, which is not a new diagnosis for me, but it's the first time I'm really writing it, is that we are misunderstanding, actually, some of the root causes of community protest or some of the challenges that we're facing, and have treated the mining sector in isolation, and therefore treated how we address risk management and so on also not in the most thoughtful way. And the reality is that we haven't seen communities made substantially better off or environmental risks being really effectively managed. And so I say that and I will answer your question, John, about good practices, because there are, but overwhelmingly, the systems that we've built have not been well designed to guide impactful decisions, to lead to impactful outcomes. And I also am not sure that the stakeholders that we're reporting to care about what we think that we're reporting. So with much more time, I could unpack that much further. But in short, I don't think that what we're reporting is what builds a license to operate, and I don't think we're doing the right activities that would build that license to operate. And I take a systems view of everything and think that there's more actors involved and there are more complexities that if we understood, we could do things better. One thing that motivates me, and this is to answer your question, and I think you alluded to this maybe earlier on too, which is that actually, overwhelmingly, the better systems that are more resilient and flexible and create value and enter new markets are better systems. They make value, they reduce costs, and so on, irrespective of what we're reporting, irrespective of the political environment. And so we've seen a lot of progress of businesses doing new things that are more innovative and more efficient, whether as an entire business model, flexibility, or within their own business lines. I think that those are largely, frankly, driven by the fact that managing risks and creating new value is actually value creating, not driven by what we're being asked to report on and irrespective of the political context. So there are many examples of that, and I think that to me they actually speak to the fact that there are examples in which we can create value and have efficiencies by doing well. Those will happen regardless of what we're reporting, and we'll find those values and we'll see the outcomes not needing a lot of these frameworks that we're spending a lot of time reporting on. But we also see that those drivers of value creation and risk management are not having the systemic impacts that we need. So it also shows to me the limitations of thinking that doing well will necessarily create value. We see a lot of value created by things that are not doing well, that are extractive by nature, that create inequality, and so on. So I think we do see a lot of good examples. They're largely driven by when businesses really do thoughtfully find ways to create value by doing things that have positive impact or can minimize costs and are more efficient. That's enabled now through new technologies. But I think the really optimal thing to do right now is to recognize the limitations of some of those frameworks and those approaches so that we can grapple with what is really feasible from a company's perspective, what is the responsibility of a company, what are the opportunities for a company, but also what are some of the challenges that need to be managed by other stakeholders in a system. And I don't mean that to disclaim responsibility, but to recognize that understanding the complexity of environmental challenges or of social unrest or of how value is created and distributed in a society relates to how multiple actors in a system operate. And it's not actually as complicated as I'm making it sound, but it's also not captured in the way that we are thinking right now about what we report to our stakeholders. So I hope I left that in a bit of a positive note, that I think that actually if we spent the time, and John, I think we've exchanged on this a bit, not actually, I don't think, by the way, that it's true that we manage what we measure. I think we measure what we're being asked to measure and report on what we're being asked to report. And if we could spend less time on that and more time thinking, where can we create value, where can we create efficiencies, and what's the limit of what we can do, and where can we work with others in a system to achieve different outcomes, that we could accelerate some of the good things that we're already seeing.
Thanks. And before I come to Peter, I'm just going to kind of slightly challenge one of those points, or ask a question at least, and that is, who is going to drive that change? If we acknowledge the flaws, if we say this is the burdens, they're not working, the regulatory frameworks, disclosure mechanisms, then you said we should focus on who is driving the change, who is this stuff for, and how will that? But who will drive the change? Because my challenge is, if we withdraw a lot of this, you create a vacuum. And for a lot of the people in this room, where do they see the incentive to start to look at those impacts?
Yes. First of all, excellent question. And the answer is that we don't have that well defined. That's a problem. But it shouldn't only be, and it will never only be driven by the market actors, and so on. It necessarily needs to be beyond that. But I get that question a lot, and you're right to ask it, because we have created expectations and the way that our economy works, that even though systems necessarily require coordination and collective problem solving, we don't we don't know shared responsibility for that. We don't identify who is in a position to convene that, and so on. So I have to say that's what we at CSI and my center do with a tiny team, is show what can happen when we bring different actors together to solve a collective challenge, and that it's necessary. So you're asking the right question, and the answer is that is one of the challenges we have to solve, is the ability to work collectively, because systems are a function of collective action. But I'm not advocating for a retreat of trying to manage risks and to do positive things. I just don't think that the reporting frameworks and the disclosures are the effective way to do that well. And I think that they've created confusion and politicization and even fatigue within companies. That's if anything, if I'm advocating for a retreat from anything, it's from ineffective reporting and more thoughtful risk management, more thoughtful engagement. So I'm actually advocating for better, more action in both fronts, just less reporting. And maybe I'll give an example or a challenge to you and to the others in the room, which is we have 11,000 companies or so that are reporting to SBTI or claiming to be SBTI aligned. And that the expectation of SBTI alignment is now so deeply entrenched that financial institutions have to be SBTI aligned, but to be SBTI aligned for financial institutions or for companies requires that they require their stakeholders to be SBTI aligned. So we have a whole system of requiring SBTI alignment. But who is actually using the information in the SBTI reports? And I don't mean the fact of SBTI alignment, I mean the information to make decisions, either decisions about whether climate outcomes are being achieved, if anyone's using it that way, don't, because it doesn't tell you anything about that, nor whether a company is properly managing its risk. That's not viewed there. So we have this whole system that, to my mind, is not producing any decision useful information. But it's deeply entrenched and takes a lot of time and resources to be preparing these reports. And that's one set of reports. And of course, you've mentioned many of the others that we do. So that's what I'm challenging. It's not the action of thinking about risk management, which is different from thinking about systems engagement. I really think understanding the fact that those are different is important. But spend more time on that thoughtfully and less time on extensive measurement and disclosure, which I think is not leading toward thoughtful behaviors.
Okay, I think I got that. I think that I still fear that, you say it's not a retreat, but I do fear that you can create a vacuum, and it's very difficult to then define what incentivizes change. Often within the companies and entities I discuss these things with, there's this phrase often that we all use, just get started. The problem is I don't think people know what to get started on if we don't have some of these frameworks in place. So I'm going to come to Peter, because I think there's a lot there, but I think for the audience, some of whom, oh, we've lost you. Okay. Okay. Well, I'm going to come to.
It's worrying. She might come back.
She will come back. I'm going to come to you, Peter.
Okay. The reason I disagree with Lisa is.
Yes. Now's the time. That risk I'm trying to get at, in terms of Lisa's position of, which I think is wholly understandable. A lot of corporate entities just feel overburdened and aren't focused on action. But where do we find the incentive? Where do we? I've got my own ideas, but what are yours? Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot in there, because, I mean, if Lisa was still on, I'd still say the same thing. Is I agree with you that it's nice for us sitting here, and I'm half in, half out of a university. It's nice sitting in a university and saying that doesn't work. But this is happening. It's like, this is real. And if we did do a retreat on reporting, then it would be the equivalent of the old CSRD to Omnibus. It would be a sort of a backtrack. It would be GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Net Zero. There would be a sort of a retreat. So let's for now freeze the thought that we're not going to advocate as an environmental movement that we should backtrack from reporting. Instead, let's make the reporting better, and let's consolidate it. And actually, it is. Now, it sounds like Lisa should be part of the people that are currently in open. SBTI version 2 is out for consultation, I think now. Is it June?
So I was talking about net zero GHG protocol.
And then the ISO net zero protocol, was it 14060, out for consultation. So that's International Standards Organization, cross-sector, and then you have people like you and SIBJO and others that will help almost like dock in to something that is inherently cross-sector. So I just think this stuff's happening. And yes, it's imperfect, but it is consolidating and consolidated, and it will happen more. I tend to think of these things as, there's one of my colleagues on Race to Zero, he talks about the conveyor belt. And this was one to look up. Is this like that you start with pioneering companies, and this is where I would also disagree with Lisa. It's like we are fairly clear on the model of change. That pioneering companies, organizations show what's possible, change the system or their system that they see, and then we become more organized. And in the case of the environment, we created Race to Zero, which is thousands of organizations in parallel to the countries, and then that sort of organizational voluntary then becomes more rigorous in terms of standards, and then eventually becomes law. And so that conveyor belt is happening. And nobody should want to get off that's going to sustainability. It's just more for people in the room to decide, do you want to help write these things and get involved? Do you want to have a C-suite that thinks through in systems and purpose and anchors? We want to be there not because we have to report it, but because we want to be there. Our vision and missions say that we should be there, and yes, we need the skill in reporting. So I just think that we tend to sort of comment as those that don't necessarily work in it and say, well, this isn't perfect. Of course it's not perfect, but where are you on the conveyor belt, and where's your company, and where do you want to move? There's a wonderful, if there's things that you can maybe do as to-dos afterwards, one is this Simon Sinek on diffusion theory, like how do movements happen? And then the other one is even shorter, 2.5 minutes on the dancer on the hill, about how we get the whole festival dancing. That's my music analogy threads through here. But the leaders are the second, third, fourth movers. And if you can be in there, then you can be talking about the systems thinking we're talking about. But you do have to have expertise to report. It's just a reality. It's going to be there.
Yeah. So it's not fair to debate Lisa when she's not here.
No, you can have a call with her afterwards, though.
You can happily debate it. I feel it'd be unfair for me to. What I would say is I mentioned possible solutions, and the thing that we haven't, or Lisa's not discussed, is are the frameworks a starting point for industry collaboration and reference points? And you've alluded to it, thank you. And as most of you know, I have several roles at the World Gold Council, SIBJO, Watch and Jury Initiative, and elsewhere. And the reason why I have those roles is to encourage collaboration and to encourage common understanding. And what I mean by that is, within the jewelry roles I have, I'm fully aware that a lot of companies don't really know what action is expected of them. And I'm not just talking about disclosure. I'm not just talking about reporting. But some of that reporting can start the action. And we found this in some of our mining members, where we said, if you start to measure this, then once you start to measure it, the implication is how do you reduce it?
Yeah.
And the reduce it takes action. And as I said, that's probably true for pretty much any entity in the room. Us as individuals, it's true too. It's a lot easier when we do it together. It's a lot easier when, frankly, you have brand leaders, when you've got associations, when you've got people producing the resources for you, so you don't have to go to a consultant and get paid, charged lots of money. The idea is we build common resources. Now, those resources probably will reference some of the frameworks that Lisa finds problematic, but I do think that's something we should look towards, and I think it's something that pretty much any company of any size, even an individual trader, can say, okay, what resources do I have at my disposal? What do I know? What do I not know? And what might practical action look like? And if you don't, and you don't know where to look, ask somebody. And that's the nature of, you heard SIBJO yesterday, there's the nature of many of the organizations and associations seeking to support the jewelry industry and the value chain. So I do think those frameworks, those collaborations and coalitions, they need. Sorry, sorry, Lisa, you're back. Sorry to lose you. I was just suggesting that my contribution to possible solutions is that regardless of the particular framework or reporting mechanism, I think a reference point which can be used for cross-sectoral collaboration is something that we really should encourage as a solution. And that for the people in this room, for instance, I was saying those who don't know where to start, they should ask someone else. And some of those frameworks and disclosure mechanisms may be a starting point as a reference. They may not be, in the end, the output, and they should not be the output. I agree with you there. So that's what I was just saying. I won't reiterate Peter's comments, but they were somewhat similar in the sense that I think, Peter, you were saying it may be to the advantage of businesses to get on the conveyor belt, as he said, towards a position of progress and leadership. And is that fair?
Yeah. I probably, just for the sake of the audience, probably don't want to repeat my arguments, but the bit that might be interesting to take this from like industry level to company, like you're in a leadership team level, I try to leave you some frameworks that might be helpful. One of the ones is on skill and will, and let's take transformation, or whatever the carefully worded title is, of of your company, or systems design, redesign of your industry, or your part of the industry, and to sit around as a C-suite or as an industry group, whichever level, and work out where you'd put your own dot, as in how skilled you feel in engineering this this new system destination, and how much will do you have to take it forward. And I've found, whether it's a C-suite team or an industry gathering with a paper flip chart, and like, this is my dot, this is my dot, the conversation that then ensues in terms of like, I know where the transition's going, and I really want to lead it, says the person that puts their dot at the top right. It's like, I can do it, but I'm skeptical. We don't have the business case. Reporting's terrible. I've been asked to report scope 3. It doesn't matter to me, etc. Like, so I'm over here. I'm the CFO. I don't think it pencils out at all, and I don't want to do this, and I want to retire before we go sustainable. And then you've got maybe the marketing director who goes, I'm enthusiastic about the message, but I don't know too much about it. But then the C-suite conversation that happens after you self-declare is really interesting at the company level. And then at the industry level, it might be like, you get trainers, like, as you say, pioneers in your industry that are willing to sort of feed into industry standards. And what was that audience you had a few years ago where you said, come and speak, 25% of the people help me write the principles, and 75% are trying to sort of comply / stay out of jail. And so I think innovation.
I didn't say stay out of jail, by the way.
You didn't say exactly like that. But just that idea of let's find where the innovators and the systems thinkers are. Let's find where the compliance people are, and have a conversation, whether it's at the company level or the sub-industry or the industry level.
Yeah, and so I was going to mention about we've talked about what leadership looks like, and you kind of just sort of outlined it there. I think in that matrix, there's the leader. I'm interested, Lisa, in your view of, in this, shall we say, complex, somewhat burdened state, where would you find leadership? How would you identify leadership, and how would you incentivize it?
Yeah, well, first of all, what you both have suggested, I completely agree, and you've articulated what took me a long time to write, I admit, so you just said it very straightforwardly. I had an article with a couple colleagues, students actually, in Aluminum a few weeks ago or a month ago on redefining corporate climate action, and it is substantially what you said, which is understand the system that we're in, strive to understand it. I think, John, you asked a good question about how we should understand it. I think partly the answer is that we haven't well defined it. We should be better, we should be more clear on what the outcomes are that we're trying to achieve, which again is different from the risks that we need to manage, those are different. But what is it that we're trying to achieve? Understand the systems you're part of, energy systems, of value chains, of labor markets, and so on. And then, exactly as you said, either just know the direction of travel so that as a company you are anticipating what the changes are going to be, managing the risks of those changes, and so on, or it gives you an insight into where you can be a leader in accelerating the transitions that we're trying to achieve. So that is the argument that we make in that little article. That's 3 pages. That is really redefining how we should think about systems change. And I think that the difference from where we are now is twofold. One is that it doesn't look at optimizing within your own corporate boundaries. It's not about meeting some targets within your own corporate boundaries. It's understanding what we're trying to achieve as a system and how can you as an entity either accelerate or at least be a part of and align with the transitions of the system. That's one part. And then maybe we will think about whether there are comparable disclosures that help with that, but I'm not even sure there are, because what it really looks like to meaningfully accelerate changes within systems or to anticipate risk is actually quite bespoke. And so I'd be more in favor of doing that thoughtfully and then communicating succinctly, actually, and in different ways to our stakeholders, what does it look like that you're trying to do to actually anticipate systems change or to drive it. So I'd love the thoughts of the two of you and also those in the room on the ideas articulated in that article and how we can build that out to see if they resonate and how to make them actually actionable for businesses and their stakeholders to make it useful.
Thank you. So I think there's a prompt there to go and check out the paper. Maybe you can send it to me and I can distribute it, Lisa, but thank you. We're running out of time. I think we are out of time. Yes, we are. I got the nod. I just wanted to make one final comment, which I kind of just to go back to yesterday's opening session and the human rights session. And there was a comment made about sustainability and it having focused, and it's true definitely on the disclosure front, on the environmental rather than the social. And I think absolutely the reporting frameworks have probably been encouraged siloed thinking in that sense. And I think most of the disclosure reporting has to some extent. But one of the things that we should all bear in mind is even if we're talking about climate and decarbonization, we are also talking about the social, because frankly, this affects livelihoods, it affects the ability of women to have education, because otherwise they may be, unfortunately, being forced to go and collect water. There's a whole load of challenges that are embedded when we talk about the word climate risk or climate. This isn't just an abstract net zero. It isn't just numbers and targets. And I think I wanted to mention that because Lisa mentioned about moving beyond abstraction. When we talk about climate, when he gave you those alarming science facts, those science facts aren't something distant. They are something that will affect every supply chain, every business. They are real and need to be factored into your thinking, particularly if you're thinking beyond the next few years in terms of your business. So I just wanted to make that because I was aware.
Please. One quick comment on that?
Yep, please.
Just very quickly, what you're saying is exactly right, and even before this climate agenda, which, by the way, again, I care existentially about, but before we were focused on climate and climate risk measurement and measuring climate performance, we recognized, as you just described, the broader set of sustainability challenges in the communities in which we're operating. And in some ways, the climate narratives and frameworks and reporting have obscured that. And you've just described, so I agree with you completely, but you've just described the climate agenda as having these other components, which they do because climate risk affects different populations differently and so on. But there are also sustainability challenges that are not core to climate. And so that is part of my concern about these frameworks that optimize for specific metrics in isolation. Because, as you exactly rightfully described, the challenges are quite broad and different in different populations. And sometimes the climate is exacerbating what has been a long-standing risk, but that means that the solution is not a climate risk, it's addressing access to water, it's addressing access to energy, it's addressing other issues that are affected by climate, but the risks and the solutions are not actually in the climate space. So I just want to appreciate what you said and remind us that actually we had this broader sense of sustainability risks and impacts that I think have been somewhat obscured by recent frameworks. So I'm grateful for your raising that.
Thank you. I'm going to let Peter have one word before I get thrown off.
No, just if we all don't anchor what looks like a sustainable system, a sustainable, resilient industry, into your main purpose statement, your main strategy, then it's not going to happen. It has to be anchored in with that, and then when you can change the system. And I would say, get on board to the conveyor belt. It is formalizing. Standards are formalizing. Discussions are open in terms of how they form. But you sort of embed resilience into the main strategy. It's not a side note.
Thank you, and thank you all for your attention. Thank you, Lisa, for the dialing in. Thank you, Peter.